Gleaming buildings, massive screens, crowds of thousands. For decades, this was the American megachurch. But that era may be fading out. Consider Mars Hill, Hillsong, Saddleback, Gateway, 4 of the largest churches in America. All of them have either collapsed or fractured. Coincidence? Maybe, but when you look at how each has been disrupted, a pattern emerges, and it points to the same place every time: the man at the top. The person holding the microphone, who somewhere along the way treated the pulpit like a stage, viewed the congregation as customers, or confused popularity with character. By the end of this video, you'll see these 4 stories as cautionary tales of how unchecked ego, power, and authority can transform a megachurch into a major disaster. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research defines a megachurch as any Protestant congregation with a weekly attendance of 2,000 or more. In 1970, roughly 50 churches in the United States met that threshold. By the year 2000, that number crossed 600, and by 2020, it had climbed to more than 1,700. The growth was real, and now the glory days of the megachurch movement have begun fading away. Before we get into specific churches, you need to understand one thing. What you're about to see is not a string of bad luck or a series of isolated scandals. There is a pattern running through every one of these failures. And once you see it, you can't look at these institutions the same way. This video covers 4 churches that built massive operations, then watched them unravel. Mars Hill, Hillsong, Saddleback, Gateway. Each story is different, but there is a common thread of internal failure that binds each one together. Mark Driscoll started Mars Hill Church in 1996, not in a building, but in his living room in Seattle with a small group of people. By 2012, that small group had grown to 12,000 weekly attendees across 14 campuses in 4 states: Washington, Oregon, California, and New Mexico. Later, the church expanded to 15 campuses. Driscoll was writing best-selling books. His sermons were being downloaded millions of times. Time magazine named him as one of the thought leaders of the young, restless, and reformed movement. This movement is a contemporary evangelical trend that emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It seeks to revive and reinterpret 16th century Calvinist theology for modern audiences, particularly younger evangelicals in the United States. The key characteristics include the sovereignty of God, the doctrines of grace, and scriptural authority. Driscoll was, by almost every visible measure, one of the most influential evangelical voices in America. Yet, behind the spotlight, a darker story began to unfold. In 2012, it was revealed that Mars Hill has spent approximately $210,000 in church funds to buy Driscoll's book, Real Marriage, onto the New York Times bestsellers list. The money went to a marketing company called Result Source, which then dispersed bulk book purchases through resellers. The church's board later said the quote-unquote true cost was less than the $210,000 reported. More importantly, a former elder later stated Driscoll himself did not initiate or sign the contract. Another elder did. Regardless of who authorized the payment, it still boiled down to a coordinated purchasing scheme, one funded by the tithes and offerings of ordinary people sitting in those seats every Sunday. But the money was not the whole story. Current and former members began documenting what they described as systematic spiritual abuse. Church leadership exercised control over members' personal finances, relationships, and employment decisions. Elders who raised concerns were publicly shamed or quietly removed. Paul Petrie, a former elder, was formally disciplined and shunned after he questioned governance changes that had handed Driscoll unchecked authority over church leadership. In 2014, 21 former pastors submitted a formal complaint to the church's Board of Advisors and Accountability. They documented in writing what they called, quote unquote, a culture of fear and intimidation.
In some ways, Mars Hill's story is like no other, but in others, it's a window into much that shapes the evangelical church in North America today.
There's a body count of young pastors whose ability rose them to prominence before their character was ready for it.
What we see on platforms, on social media, on Sunday mornings, can often be a veneer hiding a culture that's much more complex and sometimes ugly underneath.
He could demand absolute obedience, and he did. So you question him, you're out. If you're not with us, you're against us.
Driscoll is accused of plagiarizing passages in one of his books, of misusing church funds, and improperly behaving towards subordinates.
Driscoll resigned within months. The Board of Elders at Mars Hill announced plans to dissolve. Each campus was given the option to dissolve, merge, or become independent. 11 chose to become independent congregations. Just like that, the entity known as Mars Hill Church ceased to exist on January the 1st, 2015. Hillsong Church started in 1983 in the suburbs of Sydney, Australia. Brian Houston and his wife Bobby founded it. What began as a small congregation grew into one of the most recognized Christian organizations on the planet. Their worship music played on Christian radio stations worldwide. At its peak, Hillsong operated campuses in 30 countries with a combined weekly attendance exceeding 150,000 people. Then it started falling apart. In November 2021, Australian police charged Brian Houston with concealing his late father Frank Houston's SA of a young boy in the 1970s.
Confess your sin to the Lord and he'll blot it out.
Brian Houston had reportedly known about the abuse since 1999, but he did not report it to authorities. A court acquitted him of the criminal charge in August 2023, ruling he had a reasonable excuse for not reporting because the victim himself did not want the police involved.
This was a targeted attack. If I wasn't Brian Houston from Hillsong, this charge would never have happened.
Frank Houston was no pioneer for Christianity. Regardless of today's outcome, I have received a life sentence. Blaming the victim is as repulsive as the assaults themselves.
In March 2022, Houston resigned as senior pastor after a separate internal investigation found he engaged in inappropriate behavior with 2 women.
Hillsong says its founder, the married Brian Houston, breached its code of conduct with 2 women who accused the leader of inappropriate behavior. The first incident occurred a decade ago and involved inappropriate text messages. In this audio obtained by News Nation, Hillsong leaders tell Hillsong staff about the messages.
Along the line of, if I was with you, I'd like to give you a kiss and a cuddle, or a hug, words of that nature.
Hillsong says the staff member who received the text messages resigned. The second 2019 incident where Houston, Hillsong admits, ended up in a woman's hotel room disoriented after mixing alcohol and a higher than prescribed dose of anxiety meds.
The truth is, we don't know exactly what happened next. This woman has not said there was any sexual activity. Brian has said there was no sexual activity, but he was in the room for 40 minutes.
Behind these criminal matters and private failings, Hillsong's credibility had taken a serious blow. However, what was taking place in New York would make matters worse for Hillsong. Carl Lentz founded Hillsong NYC, the church's American flagship in Manhattan. He baptized Justin Bieber. He appeared on The View. GQ magazine profiled him. He built a version of Christianity aimed directly at celebrity culture. In November 2020, Brian Houston fired Lentz for what he called, quote unquote, moral failures. An extramarital affair came to light shortly after. Then Lentz's former personal assistant alleged emotional and psychological abuse inside the Lentz household.
When you give somebody so much power, they become God to people. And I think people forgot the concept of religion and beliefs. And I think that people look at Carl like he's God to them.
Two leaders, two very public collapses, and one church whose reputation has diminished. Now, if this kind of content is useful to you, hit the like button now. It helps the video reach more people. Thank you. Now, after Lentz was removed, investigations into Hillsong's global operations followed. What they found wasn't surprising in hindsight. There was financial mismanagement, a leadership culture built on favoritism, and a consistent pattern of protecting the church's reputation at the expense of its members. The numbers tell the story. Hillsong once operated more than a dozen U.S. campuses. Most are now closed. The New York location, arguably its most high profile, shut down in 2022. Atlanta, Boston, and Los Angeles are all gone or restructured beyond recognition. What's left is a global organization visibly smaller than it was 5 years ago, still trying to stabilize after years of prioritizing how it looked over how it operated. Saddleback is a different kind of story. No financial scandal, no pastoral misconduct, but it took a hit due to theology. Rick Warren, an evangelical Christian pastor and author, founded Saddleback Church in 1980 in Lake Forest, California. It grew fast. By the early 2000s, it was pulling 20,000 people through its doors every week. And Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Church, had become required reading in seminaries across multiple denominations. It provided readers with a roadmap for church growth and ministry. Warren followed up The Purpose-Driven Church with the best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Life, in 2002. That book would go on to sell 50 million copies. By this time, Warren was one of the most influential spiritual leaders in the United States. Meanwhile, Saddleback wasn't just a church. It was a blueprint for growing a healthy church. Despite the expansion of his ministry, there were those who didn't embrace what they saw as Warren's business-oriented model for church growth. Critics argued his approach relied too heavily on contemporary cultural trends rather than scriptural foundations. As a result, they felt his way compromised biblical truth and traditional church practices. One example of breaking from scripture and church tradition occurred in 2021. At that time, Saddleback ordained 3 women while Warren was still senior pastor. After retiring in 2022, he handed leadership over to Andy Wood, Shortly after, Wood appointed his wife, Stacy, as a teaching pastor. It's a move that would come with harsh consequences. As a member of the Southern Baptist Convention, Saddleback had crossed the line, and the SBC responded. While Wood defended a woman's right to teach and preach, the SBC's governing documents prohibit female ordination. As the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, the SBC disfellowshipped Saddleback in February 2023. Now, before Rick Warren's departure had settled, Saddleback's new leader was already under scrutiny. Within months, former staffers from his previous church, Echo Church in San Jose, California, came forward with allegations of abusive and authoritarian leadership. Jason and Lori Adams Brown were among those who described a quote-unquote dictatorial culture under Woods' tenure there.
Being abused myself by a megachurch pastor and various forms of abuse, including emotional abuse and psychological abuse and spiritual abuse, verbal abuse. There's a list of many things. And as I have been a survivor of this, my experience is that I can no longer, as of a few years ago, be a part of a denomination that has chosen to cover up abuse.
Saddleback's elders responded by commissioning an independent review. The Vanderbloemen Search Group conducted the third-party assessment, which included record reviews and staff interviews. The conclusion? They found no systemic or pattern of abuse under Wood's leadership. However, not everyone accepted that finding. Several former staffers pushed back, arguing the investigation was incomplete. They pointed out that not all accusers were interviewed. Additional concerns surfaced around a church merger Wood oversaw in his decision to host Pastor Mark Driscoll at a conference. Yes, the same Mark Driscoll who had his own well-documented history of allegations of pride, sexism, misogyny, bullying, mishandling of money, and even plagiarism. Nevertheless, Saddleback stood by its choice. Despite the major leadership transition, a denominational split over women in ministry, and prior allegations of abusive and authoritarian leadership, Pastor Andy Wood continues to maintain Saddleback's megachurch status established by Rick Warren. The fourth church may be the most disturbing case in this video. Robert Morris founded Gateway Church in 2000 in Southlake, Texas. By 2024, the church reported it had grown to more than 100,000 weekly attendees across 12 campuses. However, verified attendance figures from 2023 show about 25,000 people per week, making it the 9th largest church in the U.S. Morris was a respected figure in evangelical circles. He authored several books, including The Blessed Life and Dream to Destiny, and hosted a radio show that reached over 6,800 cities. He also ran the Gateway Conference, which brought thousands of pastors together every year. Then, in June 2024, a woman named Cindy Clemenshire publicly alleged that Morris had SA'd her starting when she was 12 years old. She said the abuse continued for years.
It wasn't until, even with years of counseling, that I could accept the term abuse.
Morris was a close associate of her family at the time. Morris released a statement acknowledging what he called inappropriate touching. On June 18, 2024, he resigned as senior pastor. Morris later pleaded guilty to 5 counts of lewd acts with a child in October 2025. He received a 10-year suspended sentence with 6 months to be served in jail, plus 9.5 years of probation. He was also ordered to pay $270,000 in restitution. He served 6 months and was released in March 2026. He is now registered as a sex offender. So what do Mars Hill, Hillsong, Saddleback, and Gateway actually have in common? 3 things, and none of them are complicated. First, each church was built around one person. Driscoll was Mars Hill. Houston was Hillsong. Warren was Saddleback. Morris was Gateway. When a church is built around a man rather than a mission, the two become inseparable. The congregation's faith, culture, and identity are wrapped around his personality, vision, and reputation. So when his character comes into question, whether morally, financially, or doctrinally, the church doesn't just lose a leader, it loses its soul. Second, accountability was either absent or compromised. Scandals were covered up. Elders or board members who raised concerns got pushed out. But as the saying goes, what's done in the dark soon comes to light. Despite the best efforts to conceal, justify, or ignore the shameful or controversial actions of these megachurch preachers, it wasn't a matter of if they would be exposed. It was a matter of when. Finally, the money created conditions that made corruption easier, not harder. These were not small operations. Hillsong was generating over $100 million annually across its global network. Gateway was pulling in tens of millions per year in South Lake alone. When that much cash moves through a single institution with minimal external scrutiny, temptations lurk around every corner. And here's what matters. These 3 patterns are not accidents. They are features of how too many megachurches function. They have personality-driven leadership, concentrated authority, and financial opacity that seem to be the norm rather than the exception. So what does Scripture actually say about this? The biblical model for church leadership is not a single pastor with unchecked authority. It is a plurality of elders. Titus chapter 1 verse 5 is specific. Paul tells Titus to appoint elders in every city, not one, but multiple leaders who can hold each other accountable. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, the qualifications for an overseer are almost entirely moral. They must be above reproach, temperate, self-controlled, respectable. The text says nothing about platform size, communication skills, or cultural reach. The single clearest requirement is character. The megachurch model has consistently flipped that priority. Platform first, character optional. Paul's warning to the Ephesian elders in Acts 20 was not abstract. He told them directly that wolves would rise from within their own leadership. That warning was written more than 2,000 years ago and still reads like today's headlines. Now, does that mean every large church is corrupt? Of course not. Size alone is not the problem, but the conditions that come with chasing size, concentrated authority, weakened accountability, and a congregation treated more like an audience creates the exact environment where abuse becomes predictable. Now, do you think the era of the megachurch is coming to an end? Let me know. Drop your thoughts in the comments. So where does this leave us? This isn't a story about a few bad leaders. It's about what churches choose to prioritize. When growth becomes the goal, governance gets treated as an obstacle. And that's when things start to break. Jesus started with 12 people. No campuses, no merchandise, no green rooms, The mission was never to build the biggest room in the city. It was to make disciples. That doesn't require a budget in the tens of millions or a recognizable brand. It never did. If this video made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And once again, as always, thank you for watching.